Welcome back to the channel, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you have a wonderful weekend ahead of you. Today, in Solving Your Problems, I shall have for you a look into differential captaincy and whether it is viable or not. I will have a look at players to buy in all categories: goalkeeper, defender, midfield, and forward. Additionally, I will have a look at my favorite free hit team as well as my favorite template free hit team, because there are certainly some distinctions between the pair. We will revisit why I think it is optimal to take hits in many spots again. And finally, we will have a final thought slide where we look at captaincy, 3 particular fixtures which I think are important, chip strategy as I aim to talk you out of free hit 29, and Trent, and one other thing as well. If that sounds good, then do subscribe if you have not done so already. So close to 7,000 subscribers, and this could very well be the weekend that we hit. It could be great. Equally, if you enjoy the video, drop a like on it. Without anything else needing to be said, let's hop into it. One thing we shall not have in this Solving Your Problems is, for the first time, a lack of benching dilemmas, because our benches are very thin, hence the staple piece shall not be making an appearance, but I assure you it will be back for Game Week 30, especially with so many good fixtures. Moving on to the differential captaincy. For me, there are 2 primary candidates should you be looking to go outside of Chris Wood and Erling Haaland, who we touch on later in the video, in the forward section. Bruno Fernandes and Justin Kluivert. I've listed some other options there, which I think could certainly potentially be able to be justified by yourself should you have really strong conviction. Antoine Semenyo, Alejandro Garnacho, Morgan Gibbs-White, Bryan Mbeumo, and Phil Foden. Now, saying that, you could technically justify any single captaincy option. You could justify a Jose Sarr captaincy option if you think he goes to Southampton and saves a penalty and keeps a clean sheet, and you're absolutely convinced of that. Well, then that for you would be the best decision. But taking a more generic standpoint, those are the 5 that I think, if you were to go away from Bruno or Justin Kluivert and you wanted to go for a differential, that would make sense. I personally wouldn't go for any of those. I have certainly got a bullish perspective on Semenyo and Garnacho, and I think I can see Gibbs-White doing well. And Mbeumo, not so much, but we'll talk about him a bit later. And Foden is kind of just creeping up and like slowly for me in terms of my rankings. I wasn't so high on him initially, but I'm getting there slowly. I wouldn't say I'm all the way there. I am getting there. But returning to Bruno Fernandes and Justin Kluivert, if you are to captain Bruno Fernandes, or at least you're thinking about it, then I think there are a couple of things which you need to interpret correctly and also be comfortable with if you're wrong. Firstly and foremost, what type of structure Leicester employ. If you think about when Brentford came to the King Power, it makes a lot of sense, in my opinion, not to engage in that like quicker, more transition-based game against Brentford than that Leicester did, and therefore employ a deeper block, which they did not. And they got hurt, and they got hurt badly for it. They lost 3-0, but realistically, it could have been more. If they are to do that against Manchester United, I think that'll be good for Man United in terms of the runners in like Garnacho and Højlund, but not so much Bruno because of his starting position. I think you'll see him function as a deep line playmaker more in comparison to a more traditional number 10. And I don't think that'll be great in terms of his goal scoring output at a minimum. And as such, especially when you're captaining him and you're going up against the likes of Wood, but specifically Haaland ceiling, you want to be able to access that. And I think it'll just be harder for him to access that whilst functioning as a deep lying playmaker. And you'll see like Højlund and Garnacho in particular reap the rewards of Leicester not going into that deeper block. Alternatively, if they do, I think as long as you think that he's willing to step into these like pockets of spaces that are a little bit more advanced, potentially between the lines, he will maybe even drift into the half spaces. It won't be too congested in the middle because obviously you're functioning with inside forwards as opposed to wingers, and like maybe the wing backs hold the width, and then you form something like a 3-2-5 or even like a 3-1-6. As long as like it's not overly crowded in the middle, like from a Man United perspective, and you can still see Bruno scoring. Obviously you can leverage his ball striking from distance, but also you want him just to be able to get into the box as well. That is where I think it's like more justifiable to captain him. Because if I look at the Chelsea game versus Leicester, right, on another, not so much on another day, but like if we were just a slightly better team, which I know this sounds weird, but right now I wouldn't be surprised. Actually, I do think that Man United are a better attack than us. Like I genuinely do. Even like with their structure, I guess maybe the form element of them putting Sociedad away and putting them away in style has something to do with it, but I really don't rate our attack at the moment. I think United could cause Leicester more problems than we did, especially with like the small space combinations in the middle, and you've got Bruno and Xerxes to facilitate that. So as long as you don't think that they go really open, because I think that would actually be a bit bad for Bruno if he's to play in the pivot, you'd want a little bit of protection against those waves of Leicester attacks where they commit more men forward and will have more men committed forward. I think it's okay. And Justin Kluivert, I think, is a lot simpler. I just think you need a lot of conviction because this Brentford-Bournemouth game could have a lot of goals. Who knows, Brentford may start really well, get a 2-goal lead, and then just shut up shop a little bit. With Bournemouth, Evanescence, Semenyo, I guess Tavernier off the right, they can all contribute, and you wouldn't want that taken away like from Kluivert's potential at goals and assists, but also in terms of bonus points as well. I think if you're going to go there, you just have to have a lot of conviction, but he has a really high ceiling, especially with how good he is at penalties, and the volume of shots he takes and the positions he takes up. So for that reason, I think if you have strong conviction, you can justify it. Going back to Bruno, one comparison I draw is Damsgaard, just because he also plays a little bit of a deeper role for Brentford at times, but will pop up in the number 10-like positions, though he has some similarities to Bruno. And I didn't see him be so effective in those transitions that, in comparison, I guess, to like the likes of Mbeumo and Wissa and even Sharda. And if you think about Bruno, I imagine it would be somewhat similar in nature, hence why I prefer for Leicester actually to set up in a deeper block for Bruno Fernandes in particular. Overall, in terms of the two, I don't really have a preference because my preference would lie with Erling Haaland. If I absolutely had to go for one, though, I would probably go for Bruno Fernandes just for the fixture. But like I said, it's very close and my preference is Haaland. Now, this is the exact same slide from yesterday, and you may be wondering why. Well, it is simply to reiterate my point, just because I know it strays away from what we traditionally do, where we don't take many hits, but I really do think this time around, in many cases, even if it's just one, it is optimal. So just to quickly go over the argument again, especially if you're still pondering it, let us assume there is a player up for sale. You're considering selling him. Well, realistically, his ceiling is about 0 to 1, either because he doesn't play or you think he's going to come off the bench, and hence there's seriously reduced expected minutes. Secondly, the player you would be bringing in, you would assume that they play more than 60 minutes and they have good prospects for that week. But we'll put his floor at 2 points, which means that there would be a maximum downside of 3 points. 1 point gain in terms of the appearance points, and then -4 for the hit, which would be a negative 3 point gain. That's the downside. The worst case. But the upside, on the assumption that we cap his ceiling at 13 to 16, the player you're bringing in, and I think that's fair to do so because you're not going to bring in someone that is incapable of getting that. Even like some of the good players, let's take Callum Hudson-Odoi, right? I don't think people are overly excited about bringing him in, but people can appreciate that he's got good prospects away at Ipswich because, one, he's in good form, 2, he's a good player, 3, with all due respect, it's a good fixture. And like even 4th, I think he suits that game just for the fact that like, or at least expected minutes suit that game. Because one thing I've seen with Nuno is he rewards form. And 2, I think having that like creative profile on the wing is quite useful when like on the other side you'll have Jota Silva or Nalanga who's more the runner type as well. So I think that is fair, and he essentially embodies a lot of the options, and some of them are even better than him, right? So let's just cap the ceiling at 13 to 16. It means you get an upside of about 8 to 12. And I think for a 3-point downside, it's really worth it in so many cases. Now, there will be some where, for example, you have to consider the lost value, for example, in Isak, in Salah, and you want them back on Walcott 31. Okay, then I think it becomes a little bit more complicated. But that is not the case in every scenario. And I think you can essentially attribute a value to those points for the lost value and then form another mathematical equation and see if it makes sense. I think this is less about risk tolerance and more so just about doing what is optimal, because I understand from a risk perspective in terms of minimizing risk where possible, like you just don't want to take on this -3 downside. But for me, like from a logical optimal perspective in terms of just being able to get the best rank at the end of the season, I do think that like an upside of 8 to 12 warrants you taking the hit in all of these cases where the conditions initially discussed are present. On this slide in particular, you may find some bullishness on Manchester United. Goalkeepers wise, Onana is my favourite to buy. I say it in the defenders section, but maybe I should start with it. Most of these purchases, I'm looking at a 2-game-week span just because there are going to be so many Wildcard 31s flying about. For me, Onana is my favourite. I think he's got the best fixture this week, and I think we can safely assume that. And the fixture against Forest is a really interesting one. I think Ruben Amorim will give Nottingham Forest the respect they really do deserve and go for his like deeper 5-4-1, which has been very difficult for Arsenal and Liverpool to break down. And as such, especially because it's away from home, right? And as such, I think the chances of United keeping a clean sheet in comparison to what they usually employ when they don't play the quote-unquote bigger teams increases exponentially. It increases massively. And Onana, in that type of game, well, he's got hauling prospects, right? Because it's the type of game where he'd make 6 saves, keep a clean sheet on the assumption, like with the conditions present, it's possible now. And he racks up, what, like a 10-pointer. So I think at least you're opening yourself up to that upside. And they still concede enough chances, or they'll concede enough shots against Leicester, whereby I think the save potential is still there. And as such, I can see him, even getting a 7-pointer or an 8-pointer or a 9-pointer against Leicester. So for me, he's my favourite goalkeeper. If you can't afford him, I'd go with Jose Sarr. I just think over the course of Southampton away and West Ham at home, whilst I'm not expecting a clean sheet in either of them necessarily, I know that maybe from a probabilistic standpoint, across the two, I don't have such a bad chance of getting one. And if you get one out of those two, I think it's a good success. And who knows, especially like with Wolves not being the most solid defensive outfit, and Southampton definitely having attacking quality, I can see him getting a decent sized score, even if he on top of the clean sheet as well. Defenders is very much the same thing. I like Dalot because, like I said, he is Man United are my favourite team this week in terms of targeting a fixture. I would say he's got better prospects against Leicester though, because it's more likely that he gets an attacking return. In comparison to Onana getting a haul, I think that's close. Maybe that's not strictly true, but he's got a decent chance of it as well. Apparently, I forgot how to spell favourite as well. And the other set of defenders I'll be looking at buying, aside from Ryan Nori and Guardiola, who we'll come on to, is Milenkovic and Aina. I wasn't so high on Milenkovic because Ipswich are really good at defending the box from headers and set pieces, but then I realised that Man United aren't so much in the next game week, and we're looking at it as a 2-game week span. So I think it's justifiable. And then I put Aina there, but I made the side maybe an hour ago, and since my thinking has slightly shifted, I wonder if Nico Williams, just against Ipswich is deeper block, where you need a little bit more subtlety, shall we call it. Someone just combine in those small spaces, which you can do. I've seen him do it at times in the past. Maybe that's a better route to attacking points. So I wouldn't be surprised if he gets an attacking return. Or at least he has a better chance of getting it than Ola Aina. And then Ryan Nori looks good. Similar reasons to Jose Sarr, but he looks really good going forward. He could have had an attacking return against Wolves and against Everton. And not just that of an assist, but potentially a goal. And then Guardiola is just Guardiola, right? Leicester at home 30, 2 home fixtures. Brighton at home, difficult for a clean sheet, albeit with Kusanov, with Ruben Diaz, with Nico Gonzalez, with the potential to play Kovacic in there as well, and Guardiola. I back them to keep a clean sheet against a lot of teams. Not saying that they will. I'm saying it's far more realistic, though, than maybe making it out to be. And obviously, him going forward, especially in these type of games, really, really impressive. Moving on to the midfielders, which you could buy. Firstly and foremost, just a quick mention about Bryan Mbeumo. I haven't seen him on too many free hits, nor have I seen him being purchased in abundance, at least within the community on X and on YouTube. I know a lot of people own him, but if you don't, I would at least consider him. I think his prospects are slightly underrated for Bournemouth away, Newcastle away. I'm not saying you should necessarily go there. I think it warrants consideration, and more than it's being given. There's the obvious ones: Cliver, Morgan Gibbs-White, Bruno. Semenyo and Gibbs-White, I'd say, aren't as obvious to everyone, just dependent on perspective in terms of how you interpret the fixtures and the player prospects. For me, Semenyo's still a really good option. I think he's been given a bit of a hard time at the moment just because he hasn't been returning, but I'm quite confident that I can get a decent amount of points from him over the next 2. And then Gibbs-White, like I said, those guys who can crash the blocks, arrive really well, are there and available for cutbacks, on the end of cutbacks, things like Gibbs-White, I think, and just those box threats. I like him in that sense. I think he can do well, and Ipswich have had a little bit of a struggle with that this season. And then the real dilemma with the midfielders stems in the cheaper area, because where you can't afford the, safer assets or the better assets, who do you go for? Garnacho, whilst not being particularly cheap, I think is a really, really interesting pick, and one I like a lot, which we'll discuss on the free hit. Callum Hudson-Odoi, I prefer him to Elanga now. I just think one is minutes are more secure because Nuno rewards form, and obviously he got a winning goal last time around. But I also think having a bit more of a creative winger against a deeper Forest side makes sense, as opposed to having Jota Silva and Elanga play together, where you have 2 wingers who are more sort of the runner type. So that is something to consider if you are going Elanga. I don't think he'll get dropped, but I don't know enough about Forest to say without a doubt Jota Silva won't play. Munetsi, I feel like this is just a fixtures play, right? He's been pretty decent from what I've seen so far. I don't know too much about him, hence why I'm not going to speak about him too much. But he scored against Everton as well. He only came off due to a knock, and the manager said he's fit. So I think you could consider this. Forwards, part of me really wants to say Evaniston's this great buy this week. But part of me, at the same time, just doesn't like it. He hasn't scored a brace in the Premier League this season. And that is an issue for me because by now I feel like you should have a brace. Playing in this Bournemouth side especially, I feel like the 9 should have a brace. And don't get me wrong, he's a good player and he's looked so close so many times. And that's kind of the thing about it. You know, if he didn't have the service, fair enough. But he's been given the service and he's still good enough to get himself in those positions and he looks sharp. But he just seems to lack that real ruthless like streak that I think you probably want in an FPL asset. Less so a striker because like in real life because he's doing so well, but just in terms of FPL. And to get a haul seems like a bit of a struggle. I think one of his only 2 hauls, if he's even got 2, was his like triple assist away at Wolves, and those were all like assists for penalties, which is slightly different, right? And that's not something that's going to be replicated too much. I think you can go there because like look, he could have scored a lot more points against Spurs. I expect him to cause problems against Brentford. I just wonder if he's the type of player that will help the team so much, but not get those returns, which you've seen it in the past, right? Fran Larson, if you're going to accept the lower minutes and lower floor, he does have a lower floor because he's not exactly in like the best vein of form. I think his routes to goals rely not like overly on crosses, but there's a significant weighting that needs to be put there as opposed to just like more traditional open play, in behind, pass in, like drop a shoulder, manipulate a little bit, strike across, like all of those type of goals. I think you don't really associate with that with him as much. I think they're a bit more like pace and power type of goals. And as such, for that reason, I really would be sticking to the basics in Erling Haaland, in Chris Wood, try and get them. And if you have to have 3 forwards, look, Van Nistelrooy's there, he's good. Fran Larsen's a decent punt. You may even have a 3rd forward. Wissa, I think, is such a good footballer. We'll speak about him on the free hit. And he has decent prospects of Brentford start well as well. So, like, with the 3rd forward, I'm more open, but with the other 2, I'd really be looking to prioritize Erling Haaland and Chris Wood. Here are 2 drafts which I like. The one on the left should be titled favorite template as opposed to just template, but this is my favorite template draft. I think one, it has a really nice balance in defense because I've gone for 4 teams. There's no stack there. And I think the template in general is a little bit more risk averse. So I've embodied that philosophy. I've also given you Leicester away, Ipswich away, Southampton away. So you've got all 3 promoted sides, albeit away from home, but you can't have him at home, but this time. And you've got the superstar Guardiola. Neco Williams, some attacking threat, but like I said, maybe a little bit more for this Ipswich fixture. Aït-Nouri and Guardiola have that in abundance. And then Onana, I've spoken about previously. I think that is a very solid unit. Fiverr, Haaland, and Wood, I'm not going to speak about. Very, very self-explanatory. Even Bruno, I'm not going to speak about. Very self-explanatory, considering he had his own section in the differential captaincy part. The reason I've gone Foden is, like I said earlier, I'm just creeping up on his prospects just slightly. I think the fact that he's had a good rest as well, he kind of needed it because he had been playing a lot of games. I know he had the game off against Spurs, but then they had the FA Cup. And then they had the game against Forest where honestly I felt like it was really difficult for him to perform considering the conditions that Pep gave him. Less so than Forest gave him, also Pep gave him. I think sticking him out on the left side 8. And then when he starts playing well, he takes him off. And then having Bernardo as the right 8, so you don't really have anyone to link with and combine there. And you can't really occupy that space either because Bernardo tends to occupy that a lot. For example, against Ipswich, where he got his 19-point haul, without Bernardo, I think you saw him float a little bit more, where he couldn't really do that fixture. That's that. And yeah, I think he's a high upside pick, right? So I think where I can afford a bit of a punt to stack City, I'm okay with doing so. I don't mind Savinho as well, by the way. Evanderson, I know what I just said about him, but like I said, he's playing well, and I guess you just gamble that in this fixture he does well. And then Garnacho, look, I think if Leicester are a bit more open in those transitions, in behind, can hurt. Does really well on the right-hand side. Played well against Arsenal. Played decently well midweek. I feel like the other guys played a bit better, but that wasn't to say he played badly. And yeah, it's the best fixture, so you go for the upside with him and Bruno. So that's that. And then we move to my favorite free hit. Now, I put quotation marks around the word favorite because you would have seen a different one on Wednesday. And who knows, you probably will see a different one by Saturday. But if I had to pick, this is what I'd do. A lot of it's the same. I've switched Sells and Dallo just because I got a feeling Dallo might get an attacking return. And I just thought, you know what, I'm not going to double up in defense on Man United because I'll do so in attack. So I thought it makes sense to go and get Sells. Haaland, Kluivert, Foden, we're not going to speak about. Gibbs White, for the reasons discussed earlier. Wissa, because I've been kind of high on him all week. I think if they have a good start against Bournemouth, he's got a good chance of returning. We've spoken about 9s being problems for Bournemouth, or at least 9s doing well in terms of FPL against Bournemouth. And he looks really sharp to me at the moment. Very good on the bonus point system. I can see Bournemouth being high scoring in theory at least. And if it is, he probably gets a return or two. Gibbs White, for the reasons discussed earlier. Garnacho for the reasons discussed just on the template free hit, and then Rasmus Højlund. And you may be thinking, why? He actually looked quite good against Real Sociedad. Like, no one really said much about him, but he actually looked quite good. And another day, he has... I think he got 2 assists in that game. But on another day, he has some goals as well. That's really, like, really interesting to me, especially when you go away to Leicester. I'm not necessarily 100% sure that for the whole game, they'll just sit really deep with his pace in behind and the level of physicality. I think he can do quite well. And I'm happy to go with it because, like I said, in the last side, outside of Haaland and Wood, I don't love the forwards. And yeah, sure, I'm taking on a little bit more risk, and I know I'm doing that. But I actually really do like that free hit team. So that's that. Some final thoughts on a variety of important topics. Number 1, captaincy. For me, still, Erling Haaland, numero uno. I know in everything you need to know, I said Chris Wood, marginally. Then I went to Haaland in team selection. I've gone back and forth a few times actually today. There was actually going to be a slide called Second Thoughts. And that's what I was going to start about how I might not buy Kluivert and Semenyo. And I might buy Wood and Bruno Fernandes. But eventually I got out of that for certain reasons. But for me, at the moment, best captain, Erling Haaland. And I would go there if I owned him. And I would personally look to prioritize. I think especially if you got Wood and you're not the highest ceiling forward ever anyway. Such a nice play because the downside protection is there. And you get the access to the upside because Haaland almost definitely doesn't hit 100% EO, like 110%. Risk to reward, this is to do with chips. This is to do with hits. I think you should slightly change perspective just because I think the hit is slightly different this time around. And for free hit 29, I think there's probably a little bit more risk associated to it that maybe is being shown off because the free hit 29 is fairly different to that of non-free hit 29 naturally. But I don't think non-free hit 29 teams are particularly bad. And as such, I really would look at all the games, which we'll come on to, and make sure you are picking the best team and not just going away from like non-playing free hit 29 players for the sake of it. Those 3 games on screen, I've obviously discussed and everything you need to know. And did you wish to hear my analysis and interpretation of that? You can go there. I would however really think about these games in some depth as opposed to just being like, oh, Forest are going to go to Ipswich and they're much better, so they'll beat them. Don't get me wrong. I think they'll beat them. I can see like a small victory for them. I don't think they'll blow them out of the water. I can see a small-ish victory for them. But yeah, I would just give some time to these games because I think they're all interesting to interpret in their own way, just given what they will pose. Like City, Forest, and Bournemouth are the favourites. But if someone told me that none of those won, I wouldn't be like overly surprised. Trent is out of the cup final and he's going to be out of Game Week 30. So if you want to sell him, I think it makes it easier if you were like on the fence about it. Chip strategy, I really wouldn't free hit in 29 if you can, which most of you can because you can just take hits. Even if it's up to like a minus 16, I prefer it. I think you're causing yourself so much damage down the line. When I went to look at chip strategy, it seems so difficult to navigate without a free hit. I don't even think the upside's like great for the free hit this week. A couple things go wrong, and I think you'll get wiped. Like all your gains will be wiped. I wouldn't even be surprised to see like free hits lose to like non-free hit teams, right? I would really consider it if you're going for it. Just trying to talk you out of it. And then the other games in 29. Arsenal Chelsea, for example, hasn't really got much coverage. But like there will be someone's going to score points in that game, and someone could very well haul. So I think some attention needs to be put there. Similar with like Fulham Spurs, those are 2 very good teams. There's going to be opportunities there, like Everton, West Ham. So even though there's not too much coverage on those games, I would at least consider them just to see if you're missing out on anything. And maybe one particular spot on your team, you find that it's filled by one of those players because all of a sudden you really like something. I spoke about how I don't love the forwards like this week. I think they were right. Don't get me wrong, they're pretty decent, but I don't love them. Maybe like Raul Jimenez at home to Spurs is going to score a brace, as an example, right? So I think those are all things to consider. And that is all she wrote for this video, ladies and gentlemen. And that is all she wrote for Game Week 29's content. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and I wish you the best of luck with the Game Week. I think it's got the makings of a very interesting one. So I look forward to seeing you on Sunday, probably on Sunday, for transfer plans. Aside from that, have a wonderful weekend. Like I said, drop a like on the video and subscribe if you enjoyed. And I'll see you on Sunday. Goodbye.